Some graves are not meant for the dead, but for those who are still walking. The story you are about to hear is not about dying, but about the moment a person realizes they no longer belong to this world. If one day you happen to see your own name carved into a headstone, remember this: the most terrifying thing is not death. It is the moment you are not ready to lie still. Chapter 1: The cemetery that does not appear on any map. I arrived at that village in the late afternoon, when the sky was a dull gray, as if someone had draped a dirty sheet over the world. The rain was not heavy, but it was persistent, tapping steadily against the roof of the old bus in a slow, hypnotic rhythm. The windows were fogged with condensation, warping the scenery outside until everything looked distorted and unfamiliar, like a memory recalled incorrectly. The bus stopped at a place that wasn't a stop at all. No sign, no lights, just a narrow dirt road disappearing into the forest, swallowed by mist. The driver, an elderly man with a hunched back and thinning hair, looked at me through the rearview mirror. There was something about his eyes that made my skin crawl. Not hostility, but exhaustion, the kind that comes from seeing too many people get off at the same place, and watching very few ever come back. "You're getting off here?" he asked, his voice rough and dry. I nodded, even though I wasn't sure why. I was carrying an old paper map, and according to it, there was nothing here but forest. As I stood up, the driver spoke again, quieter this time. "There's a cemetery in the woods." I froze. "It's not on my map," I said. The old man gave a thin, humorless smile. "Places like that," he replied, "never are." The doors closed. The bus pulled away, leaving me alone on the wet road as the sound of the engine faded into nothing. Silence rushed in, heavy and oppressive, so complete that I could hear my own heartbeat. I don't know why I didn't turn back. A vague pull drew me toward the forest, as if something deep inside me recognized the path. The smell of damp earth filled the air. Cold seeped through my jacket and pressed directly against my skin. I walked on, each step feeling like I was crossing an invisible boundary. The trees closed in behind me, blocking out the remaining light. And then, through the mist, I saw it, a rotting wooden fence, leaning and broken, and beyond it, faint shapes rising from the ground like the teeth of a long-dead creature. Gravestones. There was no gate, no name, no sign to suggest the place belonged to any town, any country, or even this world. The moment I stepped inside, a sudden thought crept into my mind, cold and unwelcome. I have been here before, even though every part of my rational mind insisted that was impossible. Chapter 2: My name carved in stone. I didn't step deeper into the cemetery right away. I stood there for a long time, as if taking just one more step would mean there was no turning back. The air felt different here, heavier, colder, carrying a metallic scent mixed with damp soil, like the smell of blood that had dried long ago. The old gravestones were scattered unevenly, leaning at awkward angles, their surfaces swallowed by moss. Most of the inscriptions had faded beyond recognition. Some graves had no names at all. Others were marked by nothing more than smooth, blank stones, as if the people buried beneath them had never existed. I walked slowly, carefully, avoiding patches of ground that sank too easily under my feet. Each step made a soft, wet sound, like something exhaling beneath the soil. Then I saw it. Among the decayed graves stood one headstone that looked disturbingly new. No moss, no cracks. Its gray surface was clean and smooth, impossibly out of place. I didn't understand why my eyes were drawn to it so forcefully, as if everything else around me had simply vanished. I moved closer. My heart pounded so hard that my ears began to ring. I bent down and brushed away the wet leaves gathered at the base of the stone. The name carved into it was mine. Not a similar name. Not an eerie coincidence. It was my full name, every letter and accent exactly as I had always written it. I staggered back a step, my mind spinning. I told myself this had to be some kind of sick joke, a cruel coincidence. But when I looked at the line beneath it, that fragile explanation collapsed instantly. The date of birth, every number, every detail, perfectly correct. My hands began to tremble as my eyes moved to the final line. Date of death. It wasn't in the past. It wasn't today. It was 3 days from now. A chill ran straight down my spine. I felt as though someone was standing directly behind me, leaning close to my neck, reading the inscription along with me. I spun around. There was no one there, only mist and silent stones. I reached out and touched the surface of the headstone. It was freezing cold, but not like stone. It felt more like human skin that had lost its warmth long ago. When I pulled my hand away, I realized I was shaking uncontrollably. I laughed, an awkward, broken sound. I told myself I was panicking, that my mind was inventing fear where none existed. But deep inside, another feeling was growing stronger. A terrible sense of familiarity. As if I wasn't standing in front of a grave, but in front of a reminder. Before I forced myself to leave, one last detail caught my attention. The soil around the grave was still loose, as if it had been disturbed not long ago. Chapter 3. No one in the village remembers me. I left the cemetery after night had fully fallen. The mist was thicker than when I arrived, curling around my legs like cold, wet fingers. I didn't dare look back. A part of me was certain that if I turned around, I would see someone standing beside my grave, watching me leave. The path back to the village sloped downward. The houses emerged slowly through the fog, their dim yellow lights glowing weakly, like tired eyes that no longer wished to see the world. I felt a brief sense of relief when I heard distant voices. At least there were still living people here. The first door I knocked on belonged to a small convenience shop. A bell rang sharply as I entered, shattering the silence. The woman behind the counter looked up at me. Her eyes passed over me the way they might pass over an empty chair. I need to ask something," I said. My voice sounded strange, unfamiliar even to myself. She frowned. "What is it?" I told her my name. There was no reaction, no flicker of recognition. It was as if I had spoken a meaningless string of sounds. "Are you new here?" she asked. "I arrived this afternoon, but have I ever been here before?" The question slipped out before I could stop myself. She studied my face more carefully, and something shifted in her expression. Not fear, but confusion. "You look very much like someone," she said slowly. My heart began to race. "Who?" She looked down, pretending to rearrange items on the shelf. "Someone who died, a long time ago." "When did he die?" I asked. She shook her head. "I don't remember. People die here often. The living don't stay long. Everyone forgets eventually." I left the shop with my throat dry. I knocked on more doors. The answers were always the same. No one knew who I was. No one remembered ever speaking to me. But everyone said I looked like someone who had died. At the edge of the village, I found an old woman sitting on her porch, a worn prayer bead chain wrapped around her fingers. When I approached, she lifted her head and stared straight at me without blinking. Before I could speak, she said, "You came back." My body went rigid. You know me?" She looked at me for a long time, her eyes deep and hollow. "Of course, last year, you stood right there, asking the same questions. But I've never been here," I whispered. She slowly shook her head. "The dead always say that." I wanted to argue. I wanted to scream that I was alive, that my heart was still beating, that I was standing right there in front of her. But when I pressed my hand against my chest, I realized something that made the world tilt. I wasn't sure anymore if I could hear my own heartbeat at all. Chapter 4. The Gravedigger's Notebook. The tavern sat at the edge of the village, low and sunken, as if it had been built halfway into the ground on purpose. The wooden sign above the door was so weathered that the letters were barely readable. When I pushed the door open, the smell of dampness and old alcohol rushed out to meet me, thick and unpleasant. Inside, a few men sat scattered at different tables. Their conversations were quiet, almost whispered, and they stopped entirely the moment they noticed me. No one greeted me. No one held my gaze for long. I sat at a table near the counter. The surface was sticky, as though it hadn't been properly cleaned in years. The bartender, a middle-aged man with thinning hair and dark circles under his eyes, set a glass of liquor in front of me. I hadn't ordered anything. "You'll need it," he said flatly. I meant to ask why, but when I lifted the glass, I realized my hand was trembling. The alcohol burned as it went down, but it did nothing to chase away the cold spreading through my body. As my eyes wandered around the room, I noticed a wooden shelf behind the counter. Instead of bottles, it held strange objects: a shovel with a broken handle, an oil lamp with shattered glass, and a thick black notebook coated in dust. "What's that notebook?" I asked. The bartender hesitated, only for a moment. "No one reads it anymore," he said. "Its owner never came back." I reached for the notebook. The leather cover was cracked, the edges worn pale, as if it had been opened hundreds of times by shaking hands. When I opened the first page, uneven handwriting stared back at me, the ink blurred by moisture. The Gravedigger's journal. The early entries were dry and mechanical. Dates, grave numbers, names of the dead, no emotion, no commentary, just work. But as I turned the pages, the handwriting grew increasingly erratic. They brought me someone who wasn't fully dead. He was still breathing, barely. I was told to bury him immediately. My throat tightened as I turned the next page. He opened his eyes and looked at me. He didn't beg. He just stared, as if memorizing my face. Cold sweat gathered at the back of my neck. The final entry was written in heavy, uneven strokes, the ink pressed deep into the paper. "Today I buried a man who was not yet dead. He knows. He will come back. If anyone reads this, do not dig him up." I thought that was the end. But at the bottom of the page, there was a signature. I froze. It was my signature. Not something similar. Not a coincidence. It was exactly how I had always signed my name, the same slant. The same habit of dragging the final stroke just a little too long. The notebook slipped from my hands and hit the floor with a dull thud. Every sound in the tavern disappeared. I could feel the weight of every pair of eyes now fixed on me, no longer avoiding my presence. The bartender let out a slow sigh. "You've seen it," he said quietly. "That means you've gone further than you did last time." "Last time?" My voice barely sounded human. "I've read this before?" He didn't answer immediately. Then he said, "Last time, after you finished reading, you went straight to the cemetery." A cold realization clenched my chest. I was no longer just a man who had lost his way. I was repeating something that had already happened. And this time, it felt as though everything was moving faster. Chapter 5: The Dream of Being Buried Alive. That night, I didn't rent a room. Not because there was nowhere to stay, but because I couldn't bring myself to be inside any place with a door that closed. I lingered in the tavern until most of the lights were turned off. Then left when the village finally sank into silence. I found an abandoned porch at the edge of the forest and curled up on the cold, damp wooden boards, staring into the darkness above me. I don't remember when I fell asleep. I only know that when awareness returned, I was surrounded by complete darkness. No moonlight, no wind, no smell of trees, only the smell of earth. Heavy, wet, and metallic, like rusted iron. I tried to breathe in, but very little air reached my lungs, as if my chest were being pressed from all sides. I wanted to move my arms and legs, but my body wouldn't respond. At first, I told myself I was dreaming, that this was just a nightmare born from the fear of the day. Then I heard the sound of a shovel. Not once, but again and again. Metal striking soil, earth being lifted, then falling. The sound echoed painfully close, far too clear to belong to a dream. With every thud of dirt, I felt a faint vibration travel through the hard surface above my head. A coffin. The word formed naturally, terrifyingly, like a memory unlocking itself. Panic surged through me. I tried to scream, but my throat was packed with something soft and wet. I tasted mud in my mouth. The digging stopped. Silence stretched on until I could hear my own heartbeat, slow, heavy, uneven. Cold sweat ran down my spine. Yet instead of soaking into my clothes, it seemed to seep straight into the wood beneath me. Then came a faint scratching sound. Not from outside. From inside. As if someone else was lying there with me. Fingernails scraping against the coffin lid. Trying to get out, I wanted to turn my head, to see proof that I wasn't alone. But my neck was rigid, as if nailed in place. A voice whispered, right beside my ear. "Don't move, the soil will sink." I jolted awake. My entire body was drenched in sweat. I shot upright, gasping for air, my heart pounding wildly. The old porch, the dark forest, the thin mist under the pale moonlight, all of it was there. But the smell of earth still clung to my nose, so real it made me nauseous. When I looked down at my hands, my blood ran cold. The spaces beneath my fingernails were packed with wet soil. Not dust, not dried mud, but cold, heavy earth, exactly like the soil from the cemetery. I scrambled to my feet, shaking my hands, trying to brush it off, but not all of it fell away. Some of it seemed embedded deep in my skin, as if it belonged there. In that moment, a realization emptied my mind completely. I hadn't dreamed of being buried alive. I was remembering. Chapter 6. My body begins to change. I woke up before sunrise. I wasn't even sure I had slept at all. The exhaustion inside me didn't feel like the result of a sleepless night. It felt as though something had been drained from deep within, leaving behind a hollow, icy emptiness. The morning air in the village was damp and heavy, clinging to my skin like a thin film of fog. I stood up, brushing dry leaves from my clothes, and that was when the first thing struck me. I wasn't hungry. After an entire night without food, my stomach was completely silent. No ache, no reaction, as if it had forgotten its purpose. I lifted my hand to my wrist to check my pulse, a reflex I'd had for years whenever anxiety crept in. It took several long seconds before I felt anything at all. Slow. Irregular. So faint I couldn't be sure it wasn't imagined. I walked toward the small stream near the village to wash my face. The water was painfully cold, numbing my skin almost instantly. Yet I didn't pull my hands away. I stared at my reflection in the rippling surface. My skin was noticeably paler than the day before. Dark circles shadowed my eyes, as if I hadn't slept in days. When I opened my mouth and exhaled, my breath barely fogged the air, so faint it was almost invisible. A man walking his dog passed by the stream. The dog stopped suddenly, its fur standing on end, and let out a long, piercing howl. The man yanked the leash tight, glaring at me with a mixture of irritation and fear. "It doesn't like you," he said curtly, then hurried away. I stood there, my chest heavy. Animals always sensed things humans tried not to see. As I walked back through the village, I began to notice the looks. No one spoke, but people stepped aside as I passed. A child playing near a doorway burst into tears the moment he saw me, as if he had glimpsed something that should not exist. I ducked into an empty house to escape their eyes. Inside the dim room, I found a dust-covered mirror. When I looked into it, my heart nearly stopped. My reflection was delayed. I blinked. It blinked after me. I raised my hand. The hand in the mirror followed, slowly, hesitantly, as if it needed time to decide whether to obey. Panic surged through me. I stumbled backward, my shoulders hitting the cold wall behind me. The reflection remained where it was, staring back with eyes that did not fully match my own fear. For the first time since arriving in this village, I allowed myself to think the thought I had been avoiding. Maybe I was no longer entirely alive. And if my body was changing, then it meant one thing. My time was running out. Chapter 7. The house I have never lived in. The house stood at the very end of the village, pressed against the edge of the forest where the dirt road gradually dissolved into dense trees. No one lived nearby. There was no fence, no garden, just a weathered wooden structure with a roof sagging on one side. Its front door slightly ajar, as if it had been left that way for someone's return. I don't remember how I got there. I only know that when I became aware of myself again, I was standing on the rotting front step, my hand resting on the damp, cold wood of the door. A strange sense of familiarity crept over me, not comfort, but something closer to obligation. The door opened without a sound. Inside, the air smelled of time itself, of things left untouched for far too long. The floorboards groaned softly beneath my weight, as if the house were protesting my presence. In the living room, a single wooden chair sat neatly positioned, facing a bare wall. That wall was covered in photographs. Photographs of me. Not posed portraits or travel pictures. These were images of me living, eating, reading, standing by a window and staring into the forest. The angles were wrong, low and partially hidden, as if the photographer had always been careful not to let me realize I was being watched. I stepped closer. In one photograph, I was looking straight at the camera. My face showed no fear, no surprise, only a tired, quiet acceptance. A shiver ran through me. On the wooden table in the center of the room lay a thick stack of papers, weighed down by a small stone. I picked them up. They were handwritten notes, in my handwriting. The first page was clear and steady. If I am reading this again, it means I have returned. And I have forgotten, again. On the next page, the writing began to tremble. Do not look for the cemetery anymore. Do not read the gravestones. Time does not repeat perfectly, but the ending does. My heart pounded as I flipped through the pages more quickly. Some had been torn out. Others were stained with dark blotches. I couldn't tell if it was ink or dried blood. The final page contained only a single sentence, written so heavily it looked as if the pen had nearly torn through the paper. Do not stay until the third night. I lowered the papers, my throat painfully dry. Outside the window, the forest stood motionless. Late afternoon light spilled into the room, stretching my shadow across the floor. But something was wrong. That shadow did not move exactly with me. In that moment, I understood. This house was not a refuge. It was the evidence of my failed attempts to leave. And each time I failed, I came back here to warn myself that my time was almost gone. Chapter 8: The Man Without a Reflection. I stood in front of the mirror for a long time. The glass was clouded with dust. Its wooden frame cracked and splintered, as if no one had looked into it for years. I raised my hand and pressed my fingers lightly against the cold surface. The sensation felt disturbingly familiar, not because I often stood before mirrors, but because I had stood here like this many times before. I looked straight into the glass. There was nothing there. Not a blur. Not darkness. Only the room behind me, reflected clearly, the wall of photographs, the wooden chair, the half-open window. But where my body should have been, there was only empty space. I stepped back. The mirror still showed the room exactly as it was. I raised my hand, then lowered it. No hand followed. A wave of cold ran down my spine and settled deep in my legs. I leaned closer until my breath should have fogged the glass. It didn't. There was no mist. No proof that I was there at all. That's impossible, I whispered. My voice echoed faintly in the room, hollow, as if it had come from somewhere else. I turned around on instinct. No one stood behind me. Outside, the light was fading. Darkness seeped slowly into the house. I stepped out onto the porch, desperate for air, for anything that could still anchor me to this place. That was when I saw them. Footprints on the dirt road. Fresh. Sharp. Leading away from the forest toward the village. They weren't old impressions. They weren't random tracks. They were my footprints. I looked down at my shoes. The soles were dry. The footprints didn't belong to me. I followed them without thinking. The path felt familiar, as though I had walked it countless times before. As I neared the center of the village, I heard voices, laughter. Warm yellow light spilled out from the tavern. Through the window, I saw him. A man sitting where I had sat the day before, holding a glass, smiling awkwardly. He was me. Not someone who looked like me. Not a near-perfect copy. He had my face, my posture, even the habit of resting one hand on the table when uneasy. The bartender stood across from him, speaking quietly, then placed a black leather notebook on the counter. The Gravedigger's notebook. I staggered backward, my heart hammering, and in that moment, the truth became unbearable clear. The man inside the tavern was not an imposter. He was the version of me that the world still accepted. And I had begun to vanish from reality's reflection. When the third night came, there would be room for only one of us. Chapter 9: The Truth Beneath the Earth. I returned to the cemetery after night had fully settled over the forest. The mist was thinner than before, but the air felt heavier, dense enough to press against my lungs. The trees stood unnaturally still, as if they were holding their breath. I didn't need to search. My body knew exactly where to go. My grave was still there. The gray headstone stood quietly, My name carved into its surface like a final, unquestionable statement. The third night was close now. I felt it more clearly than the passage of time itself, like a dull ache deep in my bones. A shovel leaned against a nearby tree, right where it had been before. My hands wrapped around the handle with a familiarity that made my stomach twist. I began to dig. The soil gave way too easily. Not because it was loose, but because it had already been disturbed. Every shovelful carried a strange sense of completion, as though I were finishing work I had once abandoned. Eventually, the coffin lid emerged. Dark, damp wood. Long scratch marks carved into the surface, fingernail marks. I stood there for a long time before opening it. A part of me still hoped it would be empty, that everything I had seen was nothing more than a cruel illusion. But when I pushed the lid aside, the smell of wet earth and decay rose up, dragging buried memories with it. Inside was me. Not a skeleton. Not a decomposing corpse. A body, thin, gray-skinned, intact, eyes wide open, staring straight up into the black sky above. The chest rose and fell. Barely. He was breathing. His cracked lips moved, and a voice slipped out, weak, but unmistakably clear. "You're too late." I staggered back, my thoughts collapsing in on themselves. "Then, who am I?" I asked. The figure in the coffin blinked slowly. "Both of us," he replied, "and neither." I looked down at my hands. Their edges were blurring, my fingers losing definition, as though being erased by water. I realized then that I wasn't uncovering the truth. I was being forced to accept it. The accident had happened. I had died on that rain-soaked road. But I hadn't moved on. I had clung to memory, to identity, to the shape of being human. And this village was where people like me ended up. Those who refused to lie still. The man in the coffin let out a faint, humorless breath. "When dawn comes," he said, "only one of us gets to walk away. Like every other time." I looked up at the sky. The night was passing far too quickly. And for the first time, I wasn't sure whether I feared death, or feared the possibility of continuing to exist. Chapter 10: The Accident No One Remembered. When I left the cemetery, the night was already beginning to change. It wasn't dawn yet, but a dull gray light crept into the sky, the kind that makes everything look pale and drained. Like an old photograph. I don't remember how the grave was filled again. Maybe I did it myself. Maybe someone else did. At this point, the difference no longer mattered. I walked down the road leading out of the forest. With every step, fragments of memory surfaced, as if the ground itself were returning what I had left behind. It was raining. Not heavily. Just enough to make the road slick. And then I remembered. I had been driving that night, alone, on a deserted stretch of highway. I was tired, but not sleepy. The radio played an old song I didn't like, yet I never turned it off. Rain began to fall as I approached the bend near the forest. There were no streetlights, no houses. The car skidded. I remember that moment clearly, not terror, but surprise. The steering wheel suddenly felt weightless, disconnected from the tires. Then everything spun. Metal shrieked. Glass shattered. Silence. I was still conscious. I didn't black out the way people do in movies. I lay there, the seatbelt cutting into my chest, rain pouring through the shattered window. I couldn't move my legs. There was no immediate pain, only a spreading cold that crept upward from my feet. I tried to reach for my phone. No signal. I waited for a long time. Cars passed by, their headlights sweeping briefly across the overturned vehicle before vanishing into the darkness. No one stopped. Maybe they didn't see me. Or maybe they were used to not stopping. The rain fell all night. I remember calling out, but my voice grew weaker each time. I remember thinking that if just one person passed close enough, I would live, but no one did. There was only the forest, the rain, and the dark. By morning, I was freezing. The final moment wasn't pain, it was a strange sense of relief. As if my body let go first, and my mind refused to follow. I didn't want to die there, unnamed, unnoticed, with no one left to remember me. And maybe that thought was what kept me behind. This village doesn't save the dead. It keeps those who cannot accept being forgotten. When I reached the village, the sky was already lightening. I saw the other man, the version of me the world still accepted, standing at the end of the road. He looked at me calmly, with none of the panic I felt. "You remember now," he said. I nodded. "But I'm still here." He shook his head slightly. "Remembering doesn't mean you're alive." In that moment, I understood. The accident didn't kill me immediately. What killed me was that no one was there to remember that I had ever existed. And the third night was the last chance for that to be decided. Chapter 11: The 3 Stolen Days. I began to realize that time in this village did not move the way it should when I watched the sun rise twice in the same morning. The first light was pale and cold, like a poorly made imitation of dawn. The second came later, slightly warmer, but it carried no sense of beginning. It only reminded me that I was still trapped. 3 days. The number was not random. It appeared on the headstone, in the notes I had written to myself, and in the eyes of the villagers when they looked at me, as if they were counting down on my behalf. I walked through the village, trying to measure time by small things: the bell of the old church, meals served in the tavern, the lamps lit at dusk. But everything was out of rhythm. The bell never rang the correct number of times. The food never cooled. The lamps turned on and off without the village ever becoming fully dark. A man I met by the well spoke calmly, his voice unsettling in its steadiness. 3 days is enough, he said, for a living person to realize that he is dead. I asked him what happened after that. He didn't answer right away. He lowered the bucket into the well and pulled it back up. There was no water inside, only his reflection, stretched and distorted, sinking into darkness. After that, he said, it becomes someone else's turn. That was when I understood. These 3 days were not a gift. They were stolen time, taken from others who had not yet arrived, used to patch together the existence of souls who refused to leave. Every moment one of us stayed longer meant someone else, somewhere, would disappear a little sooner. The version of me the world still accepted appeared every day. He grew sharper, more solid, while I faded. Sometimes, when we stood side by side, I could see my shadow overlapping his, thin, blurred, like a stain that had not yet been wiped away. These 3 days aren't meant for you to hide, he told me one evening outside the tavern, where the lamplight never fully reached the road. They're meant for you to decide. Decide what? I asked. Who gets to be remembered? He said. That night, I wandered alone among the old graves at the edge of the village, where names had worn away until nothing remained. So many people erased completely, as if they had never existed at all. I realized that if I stayed, another name would soon be carved into stone, and the cycle would continue. My 3 days were almost over. And for the first time, I asked myself whether my fear of being forgotten was worth someone else having to disappear. Chapter 12: The Gravedigger Returns. I met him at the deepest hour of the night, when the village sank into a silence so thick that even my own footsteps sounded distant and unreal. There was no wind, no insects. The air felt sealed, like a room that had been locked for far too long. He stood at the edge of the cemetery, beneath an ancient tree stripped bare of its leaves. I hadn't heard him approach. I only realized I was no longer alone when I lifted my head and saw him there. The gravedigger looked older than he had in the journal, or perhaps age no longer applied to him at all. His body was thin and bent, his long coat dusted with dried soil. His face was deeply lined, like rotting bark, but what held my gaze were his eyes. There was nothing in them. Not closed. Not shadowed. Simply empty sockets. You remember now, he said, his voice rough, like sand dragged across stone. I wanted to ask who he was, but the answer was already clear. The smell of earth clung to him more strongly than anywhere else in the village. Each step he took toward me made the ground sink slightly, as if yielding in recognition. You buried me, I said. He nodded slowly. And I dug you up. More than once. I asked him why he hadn't let me rest the first time. The gravedigger was silent for a long moment. Then he bent down, scooped up a handful of dirt, and clenched it in his fist. Because you kept calling your own name, he said, and when a name is still being called, it refuses to stay buried. He told me what the notebook never did, that the village was neither punishment nor salvation. It was a pause, a place where souls who could not accept their deaths were given time to understand what had already happened. 3 days was the limit. No more, no less. But there are always those who try to stay, he said, and every time that happens, the village has to steal time from somewhere else to make it work. I asked him what would happen if I refused to leave. The gravedigger turned toward the graves whose names had faded to nothing. Then there will be a new name, he said, and you will be the one holding the shovel. The words chilled me more than the night air. I looked down at my hands. They were growing translucent, their edges dissolving like mist. I understood then that my choices were shrinking with every passing hour. At dawn, he said, one of you must lie down. The other will be remembered, but not in the way you expect. He turned away and walked into the darkness, his shape dissolving among the trees. I stood alone at the cemetery's edge, no longer wanting to run. For the first time, I understood. The gravedigger was not cruel. He was simply the one who made sure that no one stayed too long. Chapter 13, The Second Burial. Dawn arrived slowly, as if the sky itself hesitated to witness what was about to happen. The early light did not banish the darkness, it only thinned it. Like an old stain that could never be completely washed away, I stood in the cemetery, where the ground still bore the marks of last night's digging, and waited. No one called for me. No one led the way. But I knew what had to be done. The coffin was already there, placed beside the grave that bore my name. I didn't know when it had appeared. The lid was slightly open. There were no flowers, no prayers, only the familiar smell of earth and a silence heavy enough to feel deliberate. The version of me that the world still accepted stood a few steps away. He looked solid, too solid. His skin held color. His breathing was steady, his eyes clear. Looking at him, I finally understood why the living never questioned his presence. "Aren't you afraid?" he asked. I took a long moment before answering. I already was, I said. I was afraid of being forgotten. Afraid that no one would ever speak my name again. But I'm tired now. The gravedigger appeared behind me without a sound. He wasn't holding a shovel. He didn't need one anymore. "This time," he said, "no one is being forced." I stepped toward the coffin. The wood felt cold beneath my hands, but the sensation no longer cut as sharply as before. When I looked inside, I didn't see a corpse. I saw myself, not as flesh, but as memory. Ordinary days, small conversations, moments no one would ever call important, yet they had once been me. I lay down. There was no panic, no struggle, only a slow release, like finally letting go of something I had been gripping for far too long. The lid closed. Wood met wood with a soft, final sound. Then the earth began to fall. One shovelful at a time. Steady. Unhurried. I didn't feel suffocated. It wasn't completely dark. What surrounded me wasn't emptiness, but a stillness so deep that every unnecessary thought quietly dissolved. For the first time since the accident, I stopped trying to remember who I was. Above me, I knew, without needing eyes, that the other man had turned and walked away. He would continue living. He would be remembered, not because I had been erased, but because I had chosen to lie still. When the final layer of soil settled into place, I didn't disappear. I was where I belonged. Chapter 14, the next one. The village did not change after the second burial. There was no bell, no sign that anything important had just occurred. The sun rose along its familiar, crooked path, casting a thin, colorless light over the low rooftops and damp dirt roads, as if everything had merely been wiped clean, never truly renewed. The man who wore my face but was no longer me left the village that morning. He walked alone and never looked back. The villagers watched him go, then returned to their routines. To them, someone leaving was far less memorable than someone who stayed too long. By noon, as the mist began to lift, the old bus appeared again at the end of the road. It stopped in the exact same place it always had. The doors opened with a long, tired hiss. A man stepped down. He carried a small backpack, shoes dusted with travel, and a folded paper map creased from repeated use. He stood there for a moment, slowly turning in place, confusion written clearly across his face. I recognized that look immediately. It was the look of someone who didn't remember why he had come. Only that he had to get off here. The driver said nothing. He simply watched the man through the mirror, then closed the doors. The bus pulled away, leaving the newcomer alone between the forest and the road. The man looked down at his map, folded it, unfolded it again. Then he frowned and lifted his head. I stood at the edge of the trees, where shadows clung to the light. I no longer had a clear shape. I wasn't even sure I was truly standing, only that I was there. I wanted to warn him, to tell him to turn back, to say there was nothing here worth finding. But I no longer had a voice. The man began walking into the forest, following the faint dirt path that led toward the cemetery. His steps mirrored mine exactly, hesitant, careful, yet unwilling to turn around. From a distance, the gravedigger appeared. He stood beside the old tree, neither approaching nor stopping the man. He only watched, like a gatekeeper who no longer needed to speak. Another one, I thought. The thought carried no despair, only truth. As the man disappeared among the trees, I felt something subtle settle into place, not soil, not stone, but continuation. This village does not hunt. It does not lure. It only waits. Chapter 15. If you find your own grave. No one in the village talks about the cemetery, not because they fear it, but because to them it is simply part of the landscape, like the forest, the dirt road, or the morning mist, things that have always been there, needing no explanation. The newcomer will find it soon enough, not because anyone points the way, but because places like that find the people who need to see them. He will stand before the headstone, his heart racing, his mind empty, and he will think it is a tasteless joke. Everyone thinks that the first time. He will read the name, then the date of birth, then the date of death. And just like I once did, he will refuse to believe it, until something deep inside him whispers that this is why he came. If you ever find your own name carved into a gravestone, there are a few things you should know. Do not rest your hand on the stone for too long. The cold you feel is not the stone's, it belongs to what has been there before you. Do not ask the villagers. They do not lie, but they never tell everything. And most importantly, do not try to prove that you are still alive. Because this village does not care whether you live or die. It only cares about whether you are willing to lie still. 3 days will pass quickly. You will see yourself fading in mirrors. Find your footprints in places you never walked. And realize that another version of you is being accepted by the world in your place. Do not hate it. It is not your enemy. It is simply the part of you that agreed to move on. If you are still there on the third night, the gravedigger will appear. He will not force you. He will only remind you. And when dawn comes, you will have to choose to keep occupying someone else's place, or to accept your own beneath the earth. I chose to lie still, not because I was brave, but because I understood that being remembered does not mean existing at any cost. Now I no longer have a shape. I no longer have a voice. But I am still here, in the pauses between shovel strikes. In the moment someone stops in the forest because of a nameless sense of familiarity. And if one day you find yourself standing before a cemetery that does not appear on any map, feeling as though you have been there before, remember this. The grave you find may not be a threat. It may simply be a place that has been waiting for you to come back. They say that if you finish this story and it still feels familiar, then perhaps it is not finished with you. Because some places do not exist on any map, yet their doors are always open. And some graves are not waiting for the dead, but for those who come back. If you walk away from this story, and can still hear the sound of soil falling in your mind, do not turn around.
Like and subscribe to Whispering Dark Tales for more chilling ghost stories.